So, just the other day, the lead singer of the legendary Australian band, most widely hailed for being a founding band of punk, Chris Bailey of the Saints, he died. And, given that he was a singer on one of my favorite albums, had some influence on writing some of my favorite music, did want to say something about it in some avenue. Since I've closed off some of my other avenues, here was as good a place to any. And there is a connection to the typical fare of Acknowledging Our Discontent that I think we'll get to at the end.
Okay.
It's a bit of a deep cut, but I think
Nice.
it'll really be worthwhile. But the brief story of the Saints was that it was founded by Ed Cooper, and then bringing in his friend at the time in high school, Chris Bailey. And I think Ivor Hay was part of it from the really early days as well. I guess they were sort of like a garage rock band. They were 50s revivalists with their music in the early days. Bailey, as he's almost always called in like the Australian music circles, and certainly by people who know him, always called mononymously Bailey.
Right.
And Cooper were both immigrants.
Right.
Bailey was born in Kenya, but lived most of his life in Northern Ireland, up to coming to Australia, I think, for the first 10 years of his life.
Yeah.
And Cooper was born in Germany, and when he came to Australia, he couldn't speak any English. So I suppose that was part of their connection.
Yeah.
In school, they founded this group that was about, they felt that a lot of the music of the time, I suppose things like Yes or larger sounding pop music like, say, Fleetwood Mac or whatever.
The ELO.
There was not enough guitar in it. It was a lot. It was soft and lacked the energy of like a Little Richard.
Yeah.
And some of the classic R&B and rock of the 50s and early 60s. They would go on to be, the famous story is that when they heard the Ramones album, they rushed to record their first album because they felt like their sound had been preempted
that's interesting.
by an international act, because
that album's Ramones debut is 76, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, their first single is 76 because they recorded and released it right after that album, and because they'd been playing with that sound live for like a few years beforehand.
So just to be clear, which city is this band?
They're from Brisbane.
Yeah, just clarification for the audience.
That's a worth delving into point, because a lot of people tie their music to the government of Joe Bjelke-Peterson, who was like this, often thought of as far-right authoritarian leader of Queensland for about 20 years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Queensland had gerrymandering up until the 1980s.
Yeah. And while maybe there's some truth to that, it does always get mentioned in the story, and both Cooper and Bailey have said wasn't really important. It wasn't what they were writing music about. It wasn't much of an influence, particularly in negative terms on what they were doing. While we're clearing up misconceptions, another misconception that I think is important to clear up is this sort of modern idea. When a lot of people retrospectively look at the Saints, they say like, oh, the glory era was like the first few albums. Actually, those albums were commercial failures at the time that didn't sell nearly as many copies as they had anticipated or hoped. And they got dumped from their record contract because of that. I mean, I think Prehistoric Sounds might be their least selling album of the whole run of the group.
Wow, to this day?
I can't say for sure. We'll talk about some of the other ones that didn't really sell, but I think...
So I was going to say, like, you'd think over time would the sales have gone up to some extent?
They did, yeah. A few of their albums charted in Australia. And I think the thing about the early years that everyone highlights, those first 3 albums before Cooper left, they were really marketed more in London because they were seen as like very connected to the punk wave, like the Sex Pistols and stuff like that, which I think both Cooper and Bailey have said that they didn't feel any connection to the Sex Pistols, and frankly that they thought the Sex Pistols were embarrassing, and they were there because, wow, we could get freight paid to go and live in London by a record company, and it's a way to promote ourselves. But like, really, we don't like their music at all. We don't feel any kinship. But all that said, I think we should talk about the albums and maybe discuss it as a quick tier list.
Okay.
So perhaps we'll go chronologically and starting with the first album. And this today is their most famous album. I think it's been retrospectively sort of canonized as the Australian punk album, or first wave punk album, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
And an important album in global punk music.
Oh yeah. It does have that rap.
I've had a mixed relationship with this one. I think it was one of the earliest ones I heard. It was like the 3rd or 4th one I'd heard. And initially I didn't like it because it does really have that, it does really feel like a sped up and noisier 50s rock record. Like a real throwback in a way that a lot of the other punk albums from the time weren't.
Yeah. I always thought the Ramones was a little bit more of that than some of the other ones.
They're like a throwback to like the first few Beatles albums though, right? This is like a throwback to like 5 years before
I've got
that.
you. Yeah. Great distinction.
Yeah. It's a real old sound. But that being said, it's definitely... I was listening to it yesterday. You know, you do have to appreciate like the abrasion and aggression of that album, which it really was a cut above like the vast majority of the stuff that it was competing in those terms in like 1977.
Especially here.
I mean, even something like Radio Birdman or other relatively...
Radio Birdman sounds pretty tame compared to this, right?
Tame in terms of like...
I don't think Radio Birdman are tame per se.
Yeah.
Compared to...
Well, what I was going to say is tame in terms of like guitar sound and like musical energy, but like they have that very like heavy psych freak out kind of vibe to a lot of their songs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like whereas the Saints on that album, it's very just like play it fast kind of thing.
Yeah. Intensity and abrasion, like that began to mean punk rather than... Because think like something like Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love has that psych freak out in the middle of it.
Yeah.
That's pretty tame Triple M song nowadays.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that I mean.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Radio Birdman has kind of like a more intense version of that, like played faster, more, maybe more wailing or whatever. It's a, or even something like X Aspirations, which I think many people say today is like the best classic Oz punk album. It's much more tame as well.
That's the Radio Birdman album?
No, X Aspirations.
Oh, sure. I was never that familiar with. I know what it is, I just don't.
Yeah. I mean,
excuse my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a record that's grown on me. I once heard the case that the album would have been like perfect if all the songs had been recorded in the same session as the single of the album, the self-titled single "I'm Stranded," which, by the way, the album is called "I'm Stranded." I kind of disagree. The actual record was recorded in like 2 days or something like that, like very fast, and it benefits. I think it has a real manic lo-fi kind of quality to it. Yeah, I really like this record. Do you have any reflections?
To be honest, like, it's definitely unique when one puts it in context, but yeah, I'll absolutely acknowledge its place in history. But for me personally, well, just to get it out of the way, this epoch of not necessarily punk rock, but traditional rock revival doesn't necessarily resonate with me personally. I can acknowledge, and I won't argue for a moment against people choosing to praise it as development or an idea within the storyline of popular music history. But I don't enjoy this album in the same way that I enjoy, not to jump ahead too much, but the next 2 albums.
Yeah. I
can appreciate this album. Like I can't argue with what you just said. Like all of what you said, it was 100% correct. Even about like the musical qualities. And if anyone put this album on, I wouldn't complain whatsoever. Would I put this album on in my spare time? No, but don't take that as an indictment against it in and of itself. But I just have to be brutally honest about that.
I kind of have to agree, because I would never put this album on either. And just because if I ever thought about it, I would just put on the next 2 albums, because I prefer them that much.
Me too.
That, yeah, I just wouldn't there'd be no reason to put this record on. But that said, it does have its place in history.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so strong album. The next one, already at the point of the next record, Eternally Yours, the group was like imploding, and like there were tensions between Haley and Cooper. And this album is like much more cynical, like morose, political. It has like horns. There's a lot of like sarcastic social commentary on Eternally Yours. With the horn section, there's also like a massively expanded sonic palette as well. I think this record is a profound step up from their first record, like absolutely huge.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
And given like how quickly this succession of records was made, like I think this was like recorded 6 months after the first album or something like that, really quickly. It's an insane improvement. Haley's vocals are really good here.
Yeah.
there are like multiple songs from this that are just like, you know, timeless classics of Australian music. This is really a classic album. This is one of my favorite albums. The opener, Know Your Product.
Oh, classic, yeah.
Yeah. Which is there's that little duology. There are two songs called Know Your Product on the album.
Yes, yes.
Like there's one called Know Your Product, as in KNOW.
Yeah.
And then there's one NO Your Product.
It's like still Know Your Product? Or?
No, I think it's just called Know Your Product, as in no.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, no.
No comma, your product.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah. Like that first one is like this real like melodic song about like advertising and like how fake everything is, and it's so cynical, but it's so epic. And then the other one is just like one of the like rawest tracks. Like if I remember, that song like absolutely implodes during the last bit of that song. It's very it's one of those songs where you can really hear the straining to play the song in it, and it really comes across very well. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this is a fantastic album. I think I'm someone who I'm fairly hard on Australian popular music. I'm really hard on Australian rock music. I just think they're all a bunch of fakes and phonies. Like, excuse my Holden Caulfielding, but honestly, I just think it's true. Most of it's just rubbish to me. However, I think if there's any class, there's a scant few mainstream Australian rock albums. By mainstream, I mean non-experimental, non-prog, and there's a handful out there in that category. So Australian rock albums in the 70s that you would find on a list of like great Australian rock albums. I mean, the ones that I really hold in esteem, like I would groups from other parts of the English-speaking world, which is to say America, UK, Canada, it's Eternally Yours and it's Prehistoric Sounds. I mean, well, let's start out with Eternally Yours, obviously. I think this sounds like a tough rock band, but a rock, like, they wanted to stay in this sort of idea of, you know, this is just rock music. We still want to sound punchy and like we have balls. However, they did have this drive to be fearlessly creative, and it didn't divorce from, this is an interesting case. Do we call this, this is an interesting case where an album like this, particularly Eternally Yours, maybe we can get into discussion for Prehistoric Sounds also, but is this a post-punk album, or is this an album which, well, I guess the reason I couldn't, why I'm thinking now, the reason I wouldn't necessarily call it a post-punk album is because it's debatable to the degree to which we want to call the Saints a punk rock band. Maybe garage rock is more appropriate, frankly.
Yeah.
And in which case we have this arty garage rock album which doesn't extinguish the initial impulses that that motivated that rock music, and where people like, you know, critics like bullshit critics like Lester Bangs would associate like with like true rock music, as opposed to, you know, the later Beatles, the stuff that the later Beatles inspired, let's say. And yeah, no, I think, but it is the horn section. One of the things that pissed a lot of heavy metal people, and I presume a lot of punk rock people off in the 1980s, is this idea of keyboards, but especially horns, have no place on truly authentic, heavy, abrasive music. I don't think if we played the Saints Eternally Yours for them, that they would have a problem with the horns, because the horns are so appropriately used and they add a punch to the music that I think is seamless.
Yeah, I think it's something that you know, it's easy to forget that like horns have a real history in, you know, heavy rock music for in those years of its evolution. As go back to some of the shit in the late 50s. It was there all the time.
Oh yeah.
Then you think about something like the Sonics, right?
Oh yeah.
You know, which were breaking ground massively. They had sax,
Mm-hmm.
and then going up to even post the Saints, you have like in Australia, you got Fungus Brains, right? They got sax in there. You know, I think it's something that like it's kind of like an element that unfortunately disappeared from a lot of rock music.
Oh yeah. I feel the same way about keyboards in like heavy music in the 80s, because it's every other heavy band in the 70s has a keyboard section.
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin used keyboards a lot. Deep Purple was very reliant on keyboards.
Yeah.
But I don't know, by the time, like, you know, groups like Van Halen didn't have keyboards, and so that just became the dominant factor, as it were, the kind of conservative rock nonsense. I mean, I'm getting to crap with it. Let's move on.
Yeah. B, I think what you were initially pointing out there is really true. This record, while post-punk is perhaps not the term,
No.
they were sort of analogously expanding their sound and like really adventuring beyond the terrain of their first album. It's a real, I think, a comparison that I've heard before for the first three Saints albums, and I think it's a pretty good one, is to Wire, and the first three Wire albums, in how they were expanding into synth sounds and electronic music, and expanding the range of what they could play on those albums in terms of time signatures and so on. Yeah, so this is the chairs missing.
That's an interesting comparison. That's quite cool.
Yeah. Now the next album, and this was recorded really shortly after the failure of Eternally Yours in the UK. I think it was actually, like, at the time it was their most successful album in Australia, Eternally Yours, but in the UK, which is where they were based for all these early albums, it was a flop. So they were going to get released from their record contract with EMI.
Yeah.
Bailey had already left the band at this point. During some of the performances, the tour for Eternally Yours, he got sick of what had been going on. He didn't like the more sort of adventurous. He thought that Cooper was becoming increasingly like pretentious.
Oh wow. Okay.
And all he wanted was sort of like simple, like caveman rock music.
Yeah.
But he was sort of even though at this time he wasn't really the star, wasn't really like the main musical force behind the group.
Yeah.
He was like the star in the public image. He'd gotten most of the publicity.
Yeah.
For the two previous albums, and was sort of, you know, as the singer, sort of naturally in some ways.
Yeah, yeah.
So he was eventually like roped back in. They managed to convince him to rejoin the band and record this sort of final album with kind of like the anticipation that this is going to be it, and this band probably won't continue. It may continue in like an optimistic future, but it probably won't. And they recorded what I think is their best album by far, and also like one of my all-time like top 10 favorite albums or whatever, which is Prehistoric Sounds. EMI was so disappointed with them at this point that they didn't even release a single. And the single was supposed to be Swing for the Crime, the first track.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the interesting comparisons as well, is that Prehistoric Sounds is structured exactly like Eternally Yours. They have the same structure. They have a similar kind of like anthemic opening track that is similar in some ways, and have this similar progression through more in intense patches and low patches. I just think that's something worth noting.
Yeah.
But what makes this album one of the best albums ever recorded, and I've made this point before, it's so expansive and so evocative and feels like so many things. I think I said this is like, you know, Brisbane 50 years in the future, like in as like the Metropolis movie, right? Fritz Lang, where there's like an underclass of people and it's like a divided society, and it's like, you know, it feels at once like primal and futuristic.
Yeah.
It's just like, you know, guitar, bass, drums. I think there's a bit of keyboard or piano rather in it, some places, vocals and a horn section. But it sounds like more than that, you know what I mean? It sounds like when you listen to the musicianship all in concert with each other in this album, you understand why those instruments went together in the first place in the founding of rock. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you'll listen, I feel like often you listen to a rock album, like a bad rock album, you'd be like, it didn't need to be this way. Like the way that this is structured is so arbitrary. Like, why did people ever think these formulas were good?
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't. Yeah.
And then when you listen to this, you're like, oh, that's why people liked this music. You know, it really provides profound meaning to some of that stuff.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Where like it's very like this album is meant to be enjoyed in the way that rock albums were typically enjoyed, but it actually is like a 10 out of 10 album. And I think quantifying any product, any work of art like that is crude, but I mean, I think this is a superlative record. I'm a huge fan of cliche post-punk, and this kind of accidentally sounds like a post-punk album. It isn't a post-punk album because post-punk's barely a thing at this time. In fact, this is the pioneering post-punk album that never got a chance to be. This came out in the months between Chairs Missing by Wire and Susie and the Banshees' debut album, The Scream. It predates Susie and the Banshees' The Scream. I literally had to look that up and just confirm that then and there. That's what I was typing away at. And also the release date of Chairs Missing. But yeah, it's phenomenal to me. I think is this the One Saints album where the bass is prominent in the mix? Oh, maybe the previous one as well.
Yeah, the previous one as well. And then
there's some spots in the 80s, excuse me.
Yeah, and I was also going to cite maybe some albums, maybe two particular albums in the 90s and 2000s as well have a bit more prominence, but maybe less cause for celebration there. Yeah, this album is the point that you make is fantastic as well, because like I think there's a lot of aspects of this that you can really like say like, oh wow, this is really forward thinking. Like for example in the track The Prisoner, like that's, as far as I can think of, that's like the earliest like punk and dub mix. Just like they have like a really prominent usage of dub like at the opening of the track that's constructed in a really weird way. I mean there may be something first. Maybe you can cite like Pierre Ubu or something. I don't know. I guess Pierre Ubu, but like it's almost less of a coherent blend. Anyway, I just think like there are so many different things going on musically, thematically in this album that it's just superlative album.
One of the greatest compliments I can say about any rock album is that, and this is a general, this is different, a rock album that's trying to be a rock album. Not what Fragile by Yes is, not what Dark Side of the Moon is, not even what Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is.
Yeah.
A rock album that doesn't make me feel like I'm wasting my time, even though I might have listened to it I haven't listened to it 15 times, but I feel as though I could. I've probably listened to it like 4 or 5 times.
Yeah, I've probably listened to this album like more than 40 times.
Wow.
Yeah, there was a period of time where I just play this in the car every day.
Mm.
Yeah, there are so many details, like, and there's so many. It's one of those records where you listen to it and it doesn't come apart when you pick apart the production details and the way the songs are written in your mind. Like, I think for so many, and when I say that, that's not something that like albums do. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are like probably the amount of albums that I could say that of where I understand how they were made, I could probably count on like one hand. You know what I mean?
Albums where like you can listen to it intently and hear like but there's nowhere in the production do you think, oh, that could have been done better.
No.
Sorry.
What I mean is, you know, I feel like when you're listening to a record and you sort of like isolate parts, you lose the whole of a track or whatever in some ways.
Yeah.
But this, I don't feel like it does that.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at actually, where like I love and worship Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division, but if you wanted to put your Steely Dan Ajar hat on, you're not going to be as like, you're going to find a lot of like things to nitpick about in that album's production, and which is kind of pointless considering the budget of that album. That album's reputation as an audiophile thing was a bit bullshit anyway.
Yeah.
Well, it's just a bunch of people from Tumblr who didn't, not to be a cunt, but like, I love Joy Division. I love and worship Joy Division, but I also love and worship Steely Dan. Those people who haven't listened to Steely Dan. Or even fucking Dark Side of the Moon, apparently. But yeah, handful of albums. One of them, strangely enough, in my opinion, is Rain in Blood by Slayer. I will stand by that. Like, and audiophiles will too, I think, because that's a rich Rick Rubin, like, at his prime stuff there. And also, like, maybe Dark Side of the Moon, maybe some of the Steely Dan albums. I heard Dark Side of the Moon recently, and I was very impressed with it, but I'm sure, like, maybe a headphone listen, you could be... I don't know. I don't want to treat it like too much of a sacred cow, but I do love that album a lot.
Yeah. I didn't necessarily even mean it in like an audiophile sense. I just mean like in terms of when you're listening to an album, if you get like analytical about it, and if you're listening to the bass line, you'll kind of lose sight of what the whole looks like. And I don't really mean like lose entirely, but you won't be experiencing the whole. You know what I mean? There's something about like picking it apart and understanding how an album works.
Yes.
That does kind of detract from your experience of the whole record.
Yeah.
And this is an album where even though like I understand and can like pick apart the different parts, and it's actually really easy to, because it's a very clean mix and there's, not a lot of elements in this album.
Three main instruments and a vocalist, right?
Yeah, 3 main instruments and a vocalist, and then plus the horns and piano occasionally. Like,
it's not a huge choir of overdubs though. It's well, compared to the rest of the 1970s, or even the post-punk movement.
It's a pretty minimal album in a lot of ways. But like the way it comes together is just alchemy. It's just like magic. It shouldn't be musically possible, I feel like, but it does. It's just an absolutely god level album. It's as I already said that Eternally Yours is one of my favorite albums, and that's definitely true. That would probably be a top 50 album for me.
Wow.
This album is as profound an improvement over Eternally Yours as Eternally Yours was over the debut. It's a truly profound release. I think I'd easily say it's my favorite Australian album.
It's one of my 10 favorite Australian albums for sure. My favorite Australian album is probably, just for a bit of fun here, is Cybotron by Cybotron.
It's a good pick.
It's such an obviously me pick, like just because I obsess over that music. I also love, like, Since I Left You, Born Sandy Devotion, anything by the Triffids. The Triffids like we could have done the show on the Triffids too, but no one's from the Triffids is dead, fortunately.
Well, actually,
oh, are they?
you don't know about David McComb?
Has he died?
Yeah, he died in like 1998. Tragically.
Oh no, okay, yeah.
You know, he's the
No.
main singer and songwriter of the Triffids. He died like super young. It was like 37, 38 or something like that when he died. And he'd only released one solo album at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, tragic. But like the guy was so talented. Like, just to go off on the Triffids tangent for a sec.
We may as well.
That like there isn't a record that they put together that isn't great. Like there are really few.
When you say records, are you going like the Born Sandy devotional to Black Swan set, or are you the demos as well?
Well, I mean, I count the records before Born. Like I'm not counting the demos, but I'm counting like Treeless Plain.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I forgot that was
Yeah.
a bit after. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about it in the set. But
Yeah,
the chronology,
I'm
a bit
saying from the first like professionally recorded Triffids album to the David McComb solo record.
I forget Treeless Plain and In the Plains are like distinct albums, but yeah, no,
Yeah.
Treeless Plain onwards.
Was
that
Treeless
set.
Plain first or in the
Yeah, no,
Treeless Plain
83,
was
86,
first,
86.
yeah. Incredible run.
And a band who, like, there's not many bands, this is a testament to how much I love a band's sound. I'm happy to also listen to a live or Peel sessions of this band. It makes no difference to me.
Yeah.
I just want to hear the Triffids.
Yes.
I guess, I don't just want to hear, like, I love, like, Houses of the Holy. I don't fucking listen to live Led Zeppelin. That's one of those boring things I can do. But,
Yeah.
it's just, some artists just do it for me.
And it actually connects back to the Saints in an interesting way. Because the way that I first heard of the Saints, or actually I heard of Chris Bailey before the Saints.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, because when I was young, really young, my dad used to play a then relatively contemporary compilation. Well, not compilation, it's really like a live album, which was the Mushroom 25 Live. You know what Mushroom Records was, right?
Can you remind me, please?
They were like, they were probably the most significant record label in the history of Australian music.
Wow.
So like all of these groups, all like I think the Triffids were on Mushroom Records. Like all the fucking big groups like Cold Chisel and whoever else, all that stuff that you think about when you think of Australian popular music from the 70s to the early 2000s, an era where it really had its own, cultural voice. A lot of that stuff is not great, and we can critique that. But
sure.
all that kind of stuff, talking uncritically about like what actually it represented culturally, a huge swathe of that was just stuff that was promoted by Mushroom Records. It was a really important part of Australia getting its own, cultural voice in music.
Nifty.
They had a 25th anniversary live performance in, I think the year that the performance was actually 1998. And it was just after David McComb died. And actually, Chris Bailey on that album, on that live performance, he does a version of, I think his favorite of his own songs, Ghost Ships. We'll get to that down the track, but he also does a duet with Paul Kelly on that, covering one of the Triffid songs. I think he does Wide Open Road. I can't remember. It's been so long. Yeah. So that was the version of Ghost Ships in particular was the first thing that I'd ever heard from anyone associated with the Saints.
Wow. Yeah, Prehistoric Sounds, brilliant album. And I just wanted to, the last thing I at least wanted to mention, one more thing about Prehistoric Sounds is, I think it's remarkable that we just want, just so everyone listening is aware, the first album was produced, okay, so Eternally Yours and Prehistoric Sounds are produced by Chris Bailey and Ed Cooper. First album is produced by individuals credited to Mark Moffat and Rod Coe. Yeah. And so when so Cooper and Bailey themselves, the fact that their production debut is as impressive as Eternally Yours is obviously well worth noting. But yeah, just the very evident improvement in their understanding of music recording for prehistoric sounds, phenomenal. Just and these guys would have been what, younger than us?
Yeah, they were.
Phenomenal.
I think when Eternally Yours was recorded, they were about like 20 years old.
Wow.
Like maybe 21.
Yeah.
During Prehistoric Sounds.
Mm.
Insane.
Yeah. Possibly, I don't want to romanticize it too much, but that I like to think it's very plausible that has a lot to do with the brazen energy of that music, the not worrying too much about I don't know, maybe when you're that early in your career, trying to kind of dig out a niche is there's a lack of insecurity there about trying to experiment, I think.
Yeah, I think they really came from, it's one of those things where they've been working for, like, I think they've been together as a band already for like 4, almost 5 years by the time they got a chance to record an album, and they were just like flooding with ideas. And I think Cooper in particular, just like the amount of sonic ideas that he had was just like exponentially expanding at this time, and the sky was like the limit then for the group. But it all came crashing down. One thing that I think about sometimes is like, what would a fourth Saints album have looked like? Because they didn't actually break up immediately after. There was like an idea to make a fourth album.
Interesting.
They stuck together for about, like, I think 2 weeks after the completion. They didn't do any tour or promotion for Prehistoric Sounds. They stuck together for a really short period of time after the release of the album before the group imploded. And from this point onwards, it's basically a different band. It's now just like a group of collaborators around Chris Bailey. And he said, I think it was kind of bold to admit this, given like how much him and Cooper have like publicly feuded over the name of the Saints and which one of them is actually creating good music and how much they all hate each other's music and everything.
Yeah.
Apparently their relationship in private is actually okay, or was actually okay, but they would always publicly like shit on each other and say like, there are all these times where like, when Bailey's asked about the Aints, he says like, oh, it's awful. It's like some of the worst music ever. And then, Cooper will say like, oh, he didn't, he hasn't progressed musically since he was like 18 years old, and all this kind of stuff. He didn't actually say that. He said something analogous to that. Like, they were constantly like shitting on each other for the entire like long period, and like,
I hate to be harsh, but one of those two statements I actually kind of agree with some of those.
Yeah, one of them I definitely agree with it, kind of as well, and kind of,
yeah.
And one that I always, I'll never forget this one. I watched some interview with Cooper on ABC, some like ABC thing. They had like an extended version of the interview they published online or whatever. It's like 2 hours long.
Oh wow!
I watched it a few years ago, and one of the things Cooper says in it is that he's like talking about the breakup of the group, and he like basically blames Bailey 100%. He's like, he's hard to work with, and just like he has like no there's like no shame or self-reflection in it. He's just like, it was all him. Just like there's something quite endearing about that. Apparently they were in like private contact like fairly often through the years.
Okay.
Like they even performed together as the Saints on like a bunch of occasions.
Yeah, no, I've read that. Yeah.
In the 80s, 90s and 2000. They had like multiple reformations,
Mm.
never to record new music, but you know, I just find that whole storyline funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, in 1978 they imploded. I think a fourth album, it's hard to imagine what that would have been looked like. Like
Yeah.
it's easy to dream about like what if that partnership could have given another album that was as profound an improvement on Prehistoric Sounds as it had been on Eternally Yours and as that had been on the debut album. I think the way that Bailey described it, he said like something like, "Oh, we were trying to be John Lennon and Paul McCartney." You know, maybe you can only dream.
Mm.
But they imploded, and it gave it, even though it had originally been founded, you know, as a high school band by Cooper, it became Bailey's thing because Cooper left to form
Laughing Clowns.
The Laughing Clowns. Very interesting.
Oh yeah.
And it gave him, Bailey, the license to use that name for whatever he wanted to use it for, I guess. And yeah, I mean, just being given, like, while you're essentially like unemployed, you've lost your record contract, you're just like wandering around, you've got no band. Just having that name, I think, is worth a lot of a group that's released several records and did at one point get significant amount of music press in the UK.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to be at least be able to keep that name for the sake of being able to put on gigs as a source of revenue. Because it's like, clubs will be like, oh yeah, the Saints, yeah, we'll put you on, we'll get people. And people will be like, oh look, the Saints are playing, we'll go. That's all it takes, is that name.
And I think it's not entirely illegitimate because...
I agree, yeah.
You know...
Well, Cooper left, like,
he did
Bailey can do what he likes with it. Like, I mean, Cooper's not going to go under any other impression, right?
Well, Cooper has, especially during the 80s and 90s, he did on various times like criticize the use of the name because he felt like the Saints had ended with his departure.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily like he didn't think that he should have the name. Like he didn't think that he was going to release stuff under the name. The Saints.
Yeah, that's important to know.
But he thought that, you know, this isn't the Saints.
Yeah.
The Saints is over now.
Yeah. You may as well call it may as well be a different band.
Yeah. However, I think it's fine. You know what I mean? There's definitely like a continued musical lineage in the project, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's Chris Bailey's band part 2 without Ed Cooper.
Well, what I mean by that is he's tried to, over the course of the albums, and we can talk about how successful some of the stuff that he did was, in this essentially different band, to maintain a musical continuity with what they did beforehand.
Oh, you know what? I think that's probably fair to say.
Yeah.
You know, I think he did. Look, Chris Bailey, I doubt he listens to Eternally Yours and Prehistoric Sounds and thinks, "No, this isn't what I wanted it to be." I mean, what do you know actually?
He hasn't commented particularly on Prehistoric Sounds much because he was miserable making that album, and he didn't want to do it.
Yeah.
He was essentially, he had to do it because they had a record contract to fulfill, and if he didn't come back to do it, you know, like essentially EMI insisted. They said, we won't accept the album because he was the public face of the band.
Of course.
Which is kind of another reason why I think him keeping the name was fair, because like, you know, when no one knew who Ed Cooper was at the time, no one knew who Ivor Hay was.
No.
Everyone knew who Chris Bailey was, or not even knew who he was, but like his image, you know.
Yeah, he was the guy on the poster.
Yeah, he was the guy on the pictures. He was the guy who, you know, they did an interview with.
Yeah, they talked to him.
Yeah.
That's how. Yeah, like you said, that's how it worked for bands. Like the vocalist was. unless the guitarist was just known as that much of a songwriting like wunderkind, like a Pete Townshend or something, or whomever you want to talk about.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it's like the idea of like, it's why they called it like a frontman.
Yeah,
You're not just the vocalist. You're the public front of the group, you know. And I feel like Pete Townsend was almost that in a way. You know what I mean? Like he had a degree of that in what he did. Like sort of like how
Jimmy Page for Led Zeppelin, not the frontman, but
yeah.
Richie Blackmore, Deep Purple and Rainbow.
I think in some of that like early classic rock that came from that, you know, tradition of the Beatles, you would have like multiple figures who were like that. You know, or you think about the Rolling Stones with what's his name, Brian Jones and Mick Jagger.
Yeah, good point.
In those days, like it was sort of a different tradition, but I think in by that time in rock music, it was really about like the vocalist and so on.
Especially as we're approaching the video era.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, go on, sorry.
Yeah, so I actually, I think it's kind of fair that he carried on the name.
Yeah, I don't think it's unfair, certainly. Again, like, Cooper left, like,
yeah,
he's forfeited his right to what happens in it, like,
exactly,
for better or for worse.
Yeah, the next thing that they released, they have released a few EPs over the years, but I do want to mention this one because I feel like this is sort of like considered like almost, some people would even say that this is like the seminal release of the post-Cooper years. They released this.
I wouldn't have heard this.
For some EP called, I always get the order messed up, but it's called something like Paralytic Tonight, Dublin Tomorrow, which I think is like a fantastic name for an EP. And it's just a return to like this really like sleek punk sound. It's pretty good, to be honest. It was released in like 1980, and it was like consciously a rejection of where Cooper was going in terms of like incorporating jazz and like experimental elements into the music. It was just about like returning to the most simple sound that they could, rock sound that he could possibly get to. It's pretty decent, and it sort of quite naturally flowed on into the next full-length album, The Monkey Puzzle, which was again a very minimal kind of punk-ish album. It's very, it's really noteworthy when you go from something like prehistoric sounds to this. This is like, such a, it's an album about nothing. You know what I mean? Like it's very much of like, maybe it's because there's multiple, songs referencing, there's a song referencing monkeys and then it's in the title, but it reminds me of the Monkees, the like 1960s boy band founded by Bob Raffleson for television. No, he recruited them, right? Like they were created for television.
Okay, wasn't there another guy involved who went on to do the Archies? Was someone involved with it? No.
Yeah, I mean there were a bunch.
I'm not a Monkees expert.
There were a bunch of people involved in the early days of like founding that.
Yeah.
But like I feel like it's a really like trivial, happy, like garage rock album. I kind of like this album. Like I don't think it's anything special. It's probably the 5th most listened to of all. I'm not even listened to the Monkey Puzzle more than the debut. It's a fine album.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. 100%. If I was asked to describe the album, you know, I would describe it as a. It sounds like a classier pub rock album, frankly.
It has the first hints of like going in the pub rock direction that would define kind of the next decade of their output, essentially.
The Monkey Puzzle to me is like, it's an accessible album. I think it's been described as pop oriented. I don't know if accessible and pop oriented are the same thing, but it's definitely a back to basics. I feel like it comes across as a back to basics album, and I don't know, it doesn't do a hell of a lot for me. I don't dislike it by any means. It's the kind of album where when I listened to it last night, I was hoping it was one of these albums where like I was relatively enjoying it for like the first half. When I realized it wasn't getting any stronger in the second half, my feelings kind of diminished.
Yeah,
I was just like, nah.
It's like one idea,
Yeah,
like iterated many
exactly.
times. Like I like the album, but like I don't think anyone will argue that it's like a great album or that it's an important album or it's that it's an album that it'll be a great tragedy if it's in the dustbin of history.
Yeah, and I'm personally like another thing that makes me like this album a little less, frankly, is just because I actually think they've put out stronger albums after this.
I totally agree. This is still one of my favorite post Cooper Saints albums, but I agree that they put out stronger albums after this.
I will say I think this is probably, I haven't ranked them, but this is most. I'd be surprised if this isn't in the better half.
Oh yeah, I might put this probably either third or fourth of the posts, which is fairly high. I guess they had like, depending on how you want to divide up some of the later projects. I mean, there's a bit of nuance there.
Okay.
Had like about 11 albums to go here.
Yeah. I'm assuming right now it's my fifth favorite of the post Cooper.
Yeah.
At least fifth.
Okay. The next album is actually probably my second favorite of the post Cooper, which is Casablanca.
Yeah, I like this album more.
Yeah, this one is sort of. This is probably like the other contender for like biggest bomb.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think commercial, like it's really. I don't know how many copies it sold. I only say this because you can't find like a good rip of this album anywhere, and like there aren't like a lot of like vinyl copies of the album going around. So I think this is kind of a I don't think this was a huge commercial success at the time, and I think like on Radio Music it has the least amount of ratings of any Saints album. But yeah, it's an interesting like transitional moment. I think it kind of returns to a lot of the elements that they threw out in the previous record.
Yeah,
like
sounds like that.
they bring back the horns, they bring back some of the acoustic cuts.
This sounds like there's overdubbing on here.
There's a lot of overdubbing
Yeah.
in some of the tracks used to interesting effect. It's more melancholic.
Oh yeah.
And it's sort of a weird mix of the kind of songs and the concept of songs. Like it's a concept album in some ways. I think it's one of. I think you could argue that Prehistoric Sounds is a concept album, just not because they had a concept, because it comes together like a concept album.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
And then there's like one other concept album in their whole discography, apart from this one.
I'd be interested to find out which one that is actually.
We'll get to it. We'll get to it, and that album will be my favorite of any post Cooper albums. Cool. Maybe I might even put it my third favorite Saints album. We'll get to it down the track.
Yeah. But yeah, I'll just say a few thoughts on Casablanca.
Yeah.
I like this album because it reminds me of the kind of music that I like around this era anyway. I like ethereal kind of, I don't know what bands they were trying to sound like. It reminds me a little bit of what Echo and the Bunnymen were going for, and what bands that were trying to rip off Echo and the Bunnymen, like early U2, like I actually do really love this band, but like what the Waterboys were trying to do.
Yeah.
And as a result, I find it quite easy to get into Casablanca. Like, again, I don't like quantifying the quality of a work of art for me personally, but I'd give this a 7,
Yeah.
which is quite strong.
I don't give numbers in
No.
quite the same way, but like, yeah, I might even give this like an 8
Okay.
or whatever. I really like this album. I think you made a good point by highlighting like the Waterboys as a comparison, because I feel like this album really brings in some of the folk elements that so much so that it was actually spun off into. I don't think you'll have heard this because you haven't had the time, but it was spun off into another album of the same name, released as the first Chris Bailey solo album.
Okay, I never heard
of just like him performing solo with a guitar. Like I think it's like half the songs off the group record, and then just a couple of new tracks as well, which it isn't as good as the actual album, but it really captures like how much of a songwriter album it is.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that there are like these two records that they had in like sort of the early to mid 80s here. Like this album and the next album.
Yes.
They're both like duologies with a solo Chris Bailey album that he released at the same time. And right before the release of the next album, he released another solo album, which is called What We Did on Our Holidays, which I think it only shares about like 2 tracks with the actual main album.
Mm-hmm.
Most notably, the song Ghost Ships, which seems to be his favorite of his own songs, because I think it like shows up on about like 3 or 4 different albums in like studio recorded forms.
Yeah.
It is definitely a good song though.
Yeah.
And this solo album that he did, which is sort of a more diverse range of tracks than the previous solo album, is pretty good. Like it's all like folk and blues influenced stuff with a bunch of like covers and stuff like that. It was obviously made fairly quickly and wasn't much of a concept behind it, but of all of his solo albums, I think it's easily the best.
Okay.
I probably won't spend much time on most of the other solo albums, because I think we may mention the next one, because I have some thoughts on it, some real thoughts on it. But yeah, this is easily the best of his solo albums. What We Did on Our Holidays, and it's like, I think it's a relatively important moment in the trajectory of the group as well. But the next album, I know you're somewhat of a fan.
Oh yeah, A Little Madness to Be Free. I love Echo and the Bunnymen, first 4 albums. Actually, some later Echo and the Bunnymen I quite like too. But Evergreen is good. But A Little Madness to Be Free sounds explicitly like, this is a point where, I'd be very surprised if they weren't influenced by Echo and the Bunnymen. And I think this is the Saints album that most sounds like a traditional post-punk / ethereal guitar pop album. And I'm just going to quickly check here. Do you know who did the production on that album?
I think it was Cooper again. Bailey again, I should say.
Under a pseudonym called Lurax Debris. That's pretty funny. But
I tried to look up what that was an anagram for, because I'm sure that's an anagram for something, but I couldn't find what it was. I think there's only been one album of the post Cooper era that wasn't produced by Bailey. I forget which one it was. It's probably one of the 90s or 2000s ones.
Right.
I forget. It might have been Howling, which we might get to, but it definitely wasn't this one. Yeah, this was self-produced. This was when they were like picking up steam. I see this as like part of the first, as well as being like a duology with the
Casablanca.
no, with the solo album that came out a month or 2 months before this.
Yeah.
I see this as being like the first album of a trilogy when the Saints were at their most popular in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, at this time, like for 90% of the history of the Saints, like they weren't in Australia.
Yeah.
They were just like living in London, like Paris, or I don't know, Sweden, wherever.
Yeah.
They haven't been based in Australia. They were like based in Australia for a couple of years in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe like Casablanca and this album were like the two that were actually, while they were based in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And then, after that, they've permanently been based in somewhere in Europe.
Wow.
And if you listen to Bailey talk, like he has a British accent. Like he doesn't have an Australian accent at all.
Yeah, Little Madness to Be Free. I rather like this album. This fits into the post-punk era of pastiche I like. It has the strings that sound like the strings on one of my favourite albums of all time, Echo and the Bunnymen's Ocean Rain, released the same year. This is 84, right? Yep, it's 84. I'm just going to do a little check. I'm very curious as to what actually came out first. Okay, Echo and the Bunnymen precedes it by 2 months.
Yeah.
May versus July.
I think this is some of the like most emotive music on this record. It has, some of the best written songs.
Mm-hmm.
It has I would actually say you probably disagree with this, but I'd probably say that it's a slightly worse written album than the next one, which we'll get to, I suppose. But I think the production on this album is much better.
Yeah, you know what? There's probably a case to be made for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with. I've heard this album, next album, twice.
I think.
Ever.
Yeah, I think, and it's the inverse for me. I've only heard A Little Madness to Be Free about like 2 times, but All Fool's Day. Oh, sorry, All Fool's Day. It was, I think, maybe the first Saints album that I heard. It's hard to remember, but like that was an album that was actually a pretty big commercial success and a hit album.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
It was sort of like a pub rock album.
Yeah, it's very commercial.
It's a very commercial record. Like this was that period of where they were really hitting a commercial sound. And I think if A Little Madness to Be Free had more like label support, because I think they were coming off one of either their worst selling album or their second worst selling album, certainly at this point.
Casablanca.
Yeah, like an album that hadn't been much of a success by any metric, apart from artistic. Because they were coming off of that, I think A Little Madness to Be Free, this is just my theory, had not gotten enough publicity in press and didn't have a single really push for it in the way that it could have done. And they did have a non-album track that would eventually turn up on an album later, released at this time. It was kind of a hit. And because of that, I think All Fool's Day really got more promotion and then was the hit that I think each of those 3 albums could have been.
The single that was released off of All Fool's Day was...
No, the single from this era, the non-album single, was actually, the album it came out on was Prodigal Son, the next one. I forget the name, it's like Grains of Sand or something like that. Is it called Grains of Sand? It's like the first track.
The first track's called Grain of Sand, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, like you, I do like A Little Madness to Be Free. Probably hold it near equal with the next album because I do like some of the songs. Like there's a real continuity with the emotion and the pop sensibilities with some of this music across these two albums. I think the pub rock vibes really intensify a lot on All Fool's Day.
Yeah, All Fool's Day to me sound like this is a listenable album, and they remind me of a better version of bands that got really big around this time that I hate, but it's a better listenable version of bands like I Hate in Excess.
Oh yeah.
And I've recently come around to liking the early bracket of Simple Minds albums, but oh boy, like 1985 onwards, it's beyond horrendous.
Yeah.
And I think the Saints and Chris Bailey found a way to make a commercial sound. You know what? I'm probably taking for granted. Some of these songs are probably more well arranged or more creatively considered than I'm taking for granted for, because I'm someone who I'm a real, like, you know, I can like an album primarily because I love the sound of the production so much. I'm a bit of a, you know, I just like that sort of thing, and not in an audiophile sense. Some of my favorite albums are not audiophile whatsoever, but yeah, I just like how things sound regardless, not necessarily because it's like a great contribution to songwriting. Songwriting in and of itself is not something I gravitate towards, and so that means that All Fool's Day, I would listen to it again.
Yeah, I think it has some of the most catchy songs. I think Just Like Firewood, particularly. What do you have the track list?
I do.
Let me have a quick look.
Sure. Can you read that okay?
Yeah.
I like these. I remember liking this. Like they have spots like Celtic Ballad on here, which I like.
Yeah. I mean, there's that. The title track is also pretty catchy. I mean, yeah, it's a good album.
Oh, you know what else I'm going to say? I'm not a particular fan of the late 80s period. I like the early jangle pop era, but there's a point around Starfish where I'm not really into what the Church are doing for a couple of years there. The second half of the 80s. Saints to me is like a better version of that as well.
Man, I strangely, I just can't agree with you there, because I do really like those Church albums. I know we've disagreed on this before.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those things that is just like a sensibility difference. Like,
I find the Churches, I don't really like stuff that's like very anthemic in a vocal sense that much. Maybe you could point out me and I'm a hypocrite on some music.
No, I wouldn't say that. I just think like it's interesting that you say anthemic, because like when I listen to it, I don't feel like it sounds anthemic to me. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Anyway, I think that's a whole different subject. The Church.
Just to be clear, I really like Blood Crusade and Seance.
Yeah.
I do.
And look,
I've sampled some of the 90s stuff. Sounds quite interesting. We'll look into more.
And in general, there's something in the music of the Church that makes it super divisive, because if you talk to a lot of people who've heard all the albums about the Church, like, you'll get people who fucking hate a lot of it. Like, there's just a lot of people who I agree on a lot of other things, and then you talk to them about the Church, they'll be like, they're terrible. Like, what? Well, like, you know, and it sounds so left field to me. I think they're just, there's something in the music, there's an ingredient in there that really hits wrong for some people and then works for other people.
Maybe the vocals rub me the wrong way. I don't know, but I like some of my favorite bands have like objectively really bad vocals. I love Rush. Geddy Lee's a terrible vocalist. I listen to a lot of Dream Theater. James LaBrie is an awful vocalist.
I can see the vocals being a part of it, because I feel like he does have.
It might be too clean for me. I don't know.
He does have a very like mundane voice, and it's always like presented in very much at like the forefront of the mix. I can see that hitting the wrong way for some people. Like it's one thing to be like a bad vocalist, and there's an.
I don't think he's a bad vocalist.
No, I mean for example, someone like Geddy Lee, but it's another thing for that to, like, it's another question whether that works in the context of the music.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think the vocals might be a part of it, because, and I feel like that critique was definitely around because he stopped like doing hooks in like the 90s songs. There were like no choruses in like some of those 90s albums, which is quite interesting. But yeah, that's A Little Madness to Be Free and All Fool's Day. Two of the relatively better later Saints albums. And then the next album, Prodigal Son. This is actually kind of one of them, like as with most of the ones we're talking about now, except weirdly Casablanca. This is one of the more well-regarded Saints albums.
Oh, okay. I can see why.
In my view, this album is terrible.
Oh.
Like, this is a genuinely awful album in my mind, and the production on this album sounds arse to me. Like, I think this album has, like, the worst of some of these, like, 80s excesses, you know what I mean? Of the kind of, like, you know, big booming, like, Phil Collins, like, solo album type sounds.
Of course, yeah.
In this, I just find it like almost unlistenable, and it's not quite the worst of the worst. And here maybe I should bring into it the third Chris Bailey solo album, Demons. This album is truly awful. Like this is a contender for like one of the worst albums from someone who's been like involved in one of my favorite albums. You know what I mean?
Goodness.
Like excluding people who are working in like a non-artist capacity on albums.
Yeah.
Like,
okay.
As a, you know, in any like an engineer or producer or whatever.
Okay.
Like this album is to me it's unlistenable. It's like the worst. You isolate like the worst cliches in the music of like Phil Collins and Bruce Springsteen and spin them out into a whole album. It's just a disaster. It's like, it's an album that I don't think I've ever like fully sat through. I've like listened to tracks and been like, this track is so bad, I'm just skipping. And then like the next track, this is so bad, I'm skipping after like a minute. And again. It's like, yeah, this, and I think, will they really change course after this point, and
yes.
Bailey's music in general change course after this point, and I think there are some really obvious reasons why, which we'll maybe discuss when we talk about Howling. But what are your thoughts on Prodigal Son?
Prodigal Son I only heard for the first time like last night, and to be honest, I found this album pretty bland and wallpaper. I didn't have such a visceral response to it. Part of it is because you mentioned Phil Collins. This may sound like strange because anyone who's known me for over 3 years and me saying this, I actually grown to really like a lot of Phil Collins' 80s solo albums.
I know you.
Not the fourth one, but seriously is when things go too far. Phil Collins doing songs about homelessness is a big no-no. But actually, even though Jacket Required has some junk on it, but the first two I actually think are great art pop albums. But like, yeah, there's some things that are unpalatable about them. And I don't think it works here. And the things that remind me of Bruce, I definitely don't like anything to do with Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah.
It lacks the Americana, just intolerable Americana crap pop on Bruce Springsteen albums. But there's something about Prodigal Son. It's very, you know, I mentioned the Simple Minds in the late 80s. It reminds me of, I really love, and this is a slight production commonality because the engineer on Phil Collins' Face Values, who got his start on Flowers of Romance by Pill, ended up producing a lot of Australian albums because I know he was a Brit. Or maybe he was Australian, I don't know. Nick Launer, I think his name is. He ended up producing Midnight Oil's 10 to 1, which is a great, very percussion-heavy sound. Love that album's production sound. But by Diesel and Dust, even though I like a lot of the messages behind some of Midnight Oil at that time, hampered by who Peter Garrett was, by the deaths Peter Garrett caused later on. But,
The deaths?
well, you know, the fucking house is burning down.
What's
the Labour
this?
Party.
Oh.
That's a tasteless
yeah.
joke, and I apologise for it.
Oh, yeah. Him and the Labour Party.
Yeah.
It's so easy to forget about that he was in the Labour Party, probably because everybody wants you to forget that.
And in that era of the scandals.
He was a minister in the government. How fucking weird is that? But yeah.
But yeah, that horrible anthemic sound that Midnight Oil had circa Diesel and Dust or Blue Sky Mining, seems to rock up on here as well a little bit. I can't call myself a fan of this album. It didn't insult me just because part of me likes this sort of vaguely bad, like lounge music kind of adult contemporary, just wallpaper music. And plus, insofar as this was part of the research, like it was just kind of a funny novelty. But man, I would never listen to this, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like All Fool's Day, I absolutely would go back to. I can't imagine going back to this.
Yeah. I guess it's just like, for me, I'm kind of with the consensus on those sounds. Like
I love the Hugh Padgham productions.
Like I know you have your own like fondnesses for like cheese and stuff like that.
Yeah, I like certain 80s production sounds. I really like 80s Genesis in general. As a huge 70s Genesis and prog geek, I do really like. It gets difficult on the self-titled and Invisible Touch, but I just love the productions of those albums. But in the songs, there's maybe like 2 or 3 on them albums I actually like. Duke and Apatap are genuinely genius. Duke's David Henschel, not Hugh Padgham.
But those sort of like booming, like massive room, epic sounds, I can't stand them.
Yeah,
like
no.
I really just even from like musicians that I like, that was actually one of the reasons it took me so long to get into Kanye West, because I still fucking hate some of that kind of production.
Yeah,
I still hate it.
That partially helped me get into it, ironically enough.
Yeah, like on like for example, the drums on, I forget, is it the first track on Kids See Ghosts? Like I can't stand that.
Wow,
like, when those drums come in.
I like Kids
on
See
that
Ghosts
track.
a lot. Yeah.
Or for example, I mean, I love Yeezus, but like the drum on the percussion or the beat on Black Skinhead, like that song is a great song in some other ways, but like I just that sound just sounds fucking bad to me.
Wow. Okay.
And like kind of like overly, booming, huge hall kind of sounds. It's just like it's viscerally disgusting to me.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I can understand that. I mean, it's so many people, like, especially in the context of the Phil Collins thing, they pioneered that. I think it just rubs people the wrong way, and I can't argue with that, to be honest. It just one day it just clicked with me. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's so peculiar, but it did.
I've heard that kind of sound so many times. It's never clicked, and like honestly, I probably like it less now than I have ever liked it. Like I just.
You know what's fascinating? Because one of the albums that does have this sound, but it's like the most cred album ever, is Pill's Flowers of Romance. But you're not the biggest Flowers of Romance fan.
Flowers of Romance fan. That's part of the reason.
Yeah, you do. I think you like the your
first two.
Yeah. I hate the first one. I love Metal Bugs.
I don't love the first one, but I think it's just like a good album. You know what I mean? Like I think it's just a very like the concept of it is fascinating.
Sure.
I love the concept of that album.
I love the idea of Pill in general.
I probably haven't listened to that album, the first Pill album, in years, and it's probably I've probably listened to like album and like Commercial Zone and like the other like Pill albums, like all apart from Flowers of Romance, all more than that album. Just because it's just such a minimal thing. But yeah.
Yeah, that's the Saints' Prodigal Son.
Yeah, Prodigal Son.
Unless you want to say anything more about Pill.
I do really don't dislike that album. It's the only like Saints album that I really think is like truly like bad, like truly just like I wouldn't be happy if someone put it on. You know what I mean? And then the solo album, Demons, which came out in 1991, has all the same traits, but like taken even further and even worse. And it's terrible. And you can absolutely, it's so obvious just based on the years that this stuff came out that, you know, he was absolutely humiliated when Nirvana came out. You know what I mean? Like, imagine doing an album like that was just like so vacuous and just like had the worst cliches of the late 80s sound well into the 90s. And just like having it so massively refuted in popular music. And you know, he's supposed to be like a real rock guy, you know, like
not like Cooper.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, especially in that context, you look at some of the stuff like something like the Laughing Clowns or the Aints. Like the Aints, I think the first Aints album came out like 91 or 92. Like it came out around the time.
Yeah.
It was like contemporaneous with the grunge explosion. And it was like right on that fucking wave. Yeah. Big time.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I love
very
that
intentionally so, yeah.
Yeah, and well, I don't know if it was intended. I feel like it. I actually, I'm optimistic that album was sort of just like a parallel movement rather than inspired by grunge. Like I think that had been in development for a few years.
Okay.
And I think it was just like an insight about musical sound. And of course, it's very different to grunge in a lot of ways. But yeah.
I was going to suggest that you have to see what month it came out if it predated Nevermind's release.
I don't think it did. It did come out after Nevermind.
Yeah.
I think it was sort of...
Was Ed Cooper based in Australia?
I think at this time he was.
Okay, here's what's really interesting. I've heard from people who are much older than me have told me that who were around at the time in Australia, in the underground Sydney, in this context it's Sydney, just to be clear, and this could be the case in Melbourne as well. In the underground Sydney music scene, Bleach was very popular.
Yeah, no. I mean, not only was Bleach very popular, but like one of the big bands from the era was named after a song on Bleach. Oh, sorry, their first album was named after a song on Bleach. The Hummingbirds, they called their first album Love Buzz after the song on Bleach. Yeah, it was
I'm
like
not familiar with the Hummingbirds, but okay, yeah.
Yeah, they were like I don't know. You'd probably like them. They were sort of like a jangle pop band.
Oh,
if you, like,
I do like that stuff.
I'm not a huge fan of the Hummingbirds, and I
Mm.
think the second album is kind of the better one anyway. But
Yeah.
that album was like kind of a hit at the time. It's seen by some people as like a kind of like an Australian classic. You know, it's seen by some people as like one of the best Australian albums.
Actually, the grunge thing is interesting because obviously it's famous that Kurt Cobain claimed that the Australian band The Scientists are the first grunge act. But you know what's more a direct lineage than that is Australia's band Feed Time, which is one of my all-time favorite groups.
Oh, yeah.
Was played extensively in Seattle. The grunge bands worshipped it. Rick of Feed Time had no idea until like 2012, and he was just kind of like, "Oh, that's cool."
Yeah.
But like, yeah, no, it's arguable that Feed Time had an insurmountable influence on the grunge scene, and so naturally, Bleach and grunge in general made an impact in Australian quarters, just because that kind of music existed in Australia and was popular, and people liked it.
Yeah, and like, I mean, speaking to the influence of Feed Time, like, what are the Melvins if not like a worse version of Feed Time?
The Melvins are a worse version of lots of. I'm not a real Melvins guy.
Like, I'm not huge on the Melvins either. Like, some of those early records particularly are good. Like, up to say like the mid '90s. They're just like they're just like a worse version of Vita. They're just like a less interesting noise rock act and some of those things. And like, to be clear as well, like those guys are just like complete assholes, and they're like so up their own ass. The Melvins are like the number one group who are up their own ass, and they have no good reason to be whatsoever. Yeah, like I can't stand like their public personas and what they represent culturally, but I think some of the music was cool back in the day.
Yeah, you know, if people played some of the early stuff, I'd probably not mind it.
Like I like Lysol and Boris and like Ozma and stuff like that. Like those are decent albums.
I didn't realize how many fucking albums these guys have.
They have like 105 albums.
What the hell, guys?
They have so many albums, and like most of them are just like recent stuff that are just like utter garbage.
Well, they've obviously just never broken up, I guess.
Yeah,
A lot of
I think
lineup changes looks like, but no breakup.
I think King Buzzo is the only consistent member.
Yeah, maybe.
Am I correct? Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Goodness.
Anyway, I don't want to give too much smoke to the Melvins. I mean, I've kind of shitted on them anyway. I think most of their music is bad. They were briefly kind of like a somewhat seminal group in some ways.
They were. I was going to say they had good timing, but like they were just part of that kind of, you know, that vague punk revival of like the early 90s. You know, they were festering in the undergroundish scene in the late 80s. Where are they from? California?
No, they're from Seattle as well. Like they're sort of seen as like the original grunge band.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because they were like they were like playing together in like 1983 and stuff.
A band like that reminds me more of I don't know if it's just the aesthetic tricking me. It reminds me more of like what Black Flag sounded like. I don't know, just like that hardcore continuation. I guess you could say maybe some of grunge was that.
Yeah.
As opposed to a distinct genre. I don't know.
I mean, kind of. Like, they're definitely influenced by, like, doom metal or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I guess one of the reasons... There are a few reasons why they're considered, like, the founders of grunge.
Black Flag had a doom metal thing, too, to be fair.
That's true. I think one of the reasons why they're considered, like, the founders of grunge is that, like... One, they were on that like first compilation. What's it called? Like Deep Six or something?
Sure.
Is it just Deep Six or is
I
it
don't
Deep
know
something
that
six?
very well.
Yeah,
I'm not a grunge aficionado, as it were.
it's okay. It's just like I don't know. It's okay. And then also that like you know the infamous Fecal Matter demo.
Yeah. I guess Kurt Cobain on that.
Yeah, it's the Melvins with Kurt Cobain.
Sure, okay,
recording a demo in like 1985.
Yeah.
Something like that. And like how, Kurt Cobain was like a groupie for the Melvins for like about 4 or 5 years.
Wow, yeah.
Before
that's pretty cool.
Nirvana took them.
There you go.
Well, I don't know. Like, there's somewhat important in the history of grunge music.
Oh, yeah.
I'd much prefer to listen to Feet Town.
Feet Town on my jam. All about it.
But yeah, to sort of go back, I think Bailey was humiliated by grunge, the explosion of grunge and alternative music in general. I think it exposed what he'd been doing in the late 80s and early 90s as far more up his own ass than any Ed Cooper project had ever been. And he came back with this album, Howling, which really very obviously and very consciously is trying to bite sounds that were contemporary at the time and trying to like jump on the alternative rock bandwagon in a way that really like doesn't come across very well today and really sounds obvious today.
And especially coming out in 1996, you can only imagine how this felt at the time. Like, grunge is a little bit over in 96.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily grunge. Like, I mean, I think there's...
Well, alt-rock.
Yeah,
90s mainstreamish alt-rock.
It was still going on. You know, like, I feel like...
Especially in this country, we had still a pretty big acts emerging.
Oh, like,
Silverchair.
alt-rock in this country ended in, like, 2009. Like, seriously, like, alt-rock in this country was, like...
That's a point. There's a
the
point
thing
there.
for a really long period of time. But, like, I think internationally it kind of was, like, 2002 when it was, like, finally died. You know what I mean?
Things like Queens of the Stone Age are basically retro acts after a while.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or
exactly.
Foo Fighters even. Like
Yeah,
retro
I think
act.
the first
Vaguely retro acts.
yeah, actually I'll update my year to 2001 because I think that's a great that first Queens of the Stone Age, which is like what 2002 or something.
Well, their first album's 98. The
Maybe-
Songs for the Deaf is 2002. Is that what you're
Okay.
thinking of?
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking of that.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Which Dave
such like
draws on, funnily enough.
that's such a retro album that maybe that is like a representation of how that kind of alternative rock movement that had come out of in a way
Yeah,
was dead.
Songs for the Deaf, it's like a bit of the 90s sound with mixed with a bit of what it was getting back, what the 90s thing was getting back at the 70s thing.
Yeah.
The 90s wanted to bypass the 80s in a way.
Yeah.
Like, you know, it was kind of going back to earthy hard rock.
Yeah.
With punk in it too. I mean, punk was seen as more earthy in the 70s.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's interesting to think about. I'm not the biggest. I quite like Caius, but Queens of the Stone Age. People have talked about like Clockwork's one of the best albums of the 2010s. It just sounds like a Queens of the Stone Age album to me. It's okay.
I was hyped for it when it came out, and it never kind of like clicked for me.
I listened to it the year after it came out.
Like I actually saw them on that tour.
Oh, cool. Wait, they came to Sydney?
They came to Sydney.
Where'd they play?
I forget. I saw them live in that tour. It was fun. Like,
Sure,
I
sure,
mean,
it'd be fun.
they
Why
played
not?
some-
Yeah.
they
He's
played-
he's a funny front man. I like him.
He's a very charismatic guy.
Yeah. No, I like
And
Caius.
like I think
The
he's-
Desert Sessions is good. Hey, you heard that?
that's probably the best thing he ever
Yeah,
did.
no, those are classic. I didn't
Yeah.
hear those till recently.
I'm not even like crazy about Caius, to be honest. Like
I
think
like
it's
that
just-
scene a lot as mood music.
I think it's okay. Like
Desert rock scene I
I've
like.
never been
Yeah.
like crazy about it. I just think it's okay.
I will say they do seem piss weak compared to the actual stoner metal bands that were popping up like Sleep or Electric Wizard in the UK.
I mean, even
That stuff's more
those are-
intense and better at that.
those are way better. But like, I'm not exactly crazy about any of that kind of music.
It's mood
I just-
music. It's,
Yeah,
it's what it
I mean,
is.
it's just like
It's time and place music.
It's
Which
just
a
not-
time and place I'm usually at.
Yeah, it's just not my time and place, I guess.
Yeah.
But
It is totally dependent on drugs. Just to be clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just let's
Yeah.
not kid ourselves.
Yeah, but yeah. Anyway, to go back to Howling, I think, like, yeah, he does a better like alternative rock era album than I think a lot of his contemporaries really managed to. Like it does, like if you switched out the vocals for someone else, it does sound like it could be like some new band coming out of like England. You know what I mean? In
I agree.
1996.
I agree.
It has like some.
I wouldn't have picked up on that. That's a good point.
It has some like electronic touches as well.
Yeah.
And it has a very saturated guitar sound.
Yeah.
It sounds very. It doesn't sound as much like some old band who was just like lost trying to like phone it in with a new sound.
Yeah.
Which you got to give that credit for. You know what I mean? Like,
that's fair.
I think
Okay.
there's an accomplishment to that. But apart from that, it's not a fantastic album. It's not one that I'll ever find myself listening to. It does have one of the best songs. It does have Something Wicked, which I think Bailey has always viewed as like one of the best Saint songs, and to be honest, it kind of is a great song.
Okay.
It's very much like it could have come from one of the earlier albums. It's just like I think it's like the only like or one of like maybe two softer tracks on the whole album.
Okay. I was going to say, I don't remember this off the top of my head.
It's a bit of a.
The softer track? Yeah, sure.
It's like a
Okay.
bit of a ballad. Like I could easily imagine it like showing up on like Casablanca,
Yeah, okay.
for example.
Yeah.
It is a really good track.
Yeah. This album didn't make an impression on me, to be
Yeah.
honest. And a part of it was overshadowed, not to jump ahead too much, but I suppose we are going to anyway. It was overshadowed by certainly the very next one for me.
You like this one?
It sounds like it has a personality. I don't think it's I don't think it's an impressive album, but I think it's an album with personality.
You know this.
What
one,
do you think of this album?
I kind of like this one as well, and it's sort of almost like the canonical like shit Saints album,
Oh, okay.
but I do like it. It's a pop punk album, really. Like I think
A little bit, yeah, but a good one.
it's like a return to it's like a return to the Monkey Puzzle type stuff, but then we've put in like more
There's
piano
distortion
and
on
like
that. Like the guitars are. Like,
oh yeah, I
heavy-ish.
mean, I'm not saying it's not like heavy. I mean, some of the pop punk, I guess, especially from that era, like the '90s, late '90s, there was some heavy music in there as well, I guess.
I'm definitely not a post-pop punk aficionado.
Oh, I'm not either. But this to me sounds like pop punk by a first wave punk band.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty good album, and it's supremely listenable. You know what I mean?
You know what I could compare it to? Like that pop punk by a first wave punk band. Pop punk by like Husker Du, but the songs aren't as good as what Husker Du would write.
Yeah,
Because Husker Du were just geniuses.
yeah.
So
It sounds like one of those kind of groups if they were going to release a pop punk album while like pop punk was at the height of its popularity.
Yeah, while it's being uncynical about it. This album doesn't sound cynical to me.
Yeah,
Like the previous album sounds a bit insecure, like he's not sure if it's like, oh, dude, am I legit? I think this one is more of a sincere. Sounds more confident to me. I don't know if that's.
The difference I feel like you might be picking up on is like the vocals, because I think on the previous album he really changed up his vocal styles. It's like the most like vocally aggressive Saints album ever. I think.
Yeah, you're right.
And
actually,
he's just like. I mean, I guess it makes sense for an album called Howling, but like, I think it's not exactly a fantastic. You know, it's not where he sits most naturally. I think it's not the style that most of his other records have. And I think he's. It feels a lot more natural sitting back in that fairly melodic but kind of morose vocal register.
Yeah, the shouting is almost like like Greg Sage-ish?
Yeah, it's Greg Sage-ish. Yeah. It's like it's kind of. Or I was also hearing like you think about the way that like Kurt Cobain loved to like strain his voice and stuff like that.
Sure.
I think the vocals on that album, if I'm sure that it would have, with hindsight, they probably would have done it a different way. Yeah. What's the name of that 98 album again? It's like Everybody and the Monkey. Oh, what's the name?
Everybody Knows the Monkey.
Everybody Knows the Monkey. Yeah.
We're back to monkeys.
It reminds me of that John Lennon track off the White Album.
Everybody's got something to hide except me and my monkey.
Monkey.
Good song.
Yeah, good song.
Good song. Great, genius album.
Yeah, and an interesting moment in the Saints discography. I think this was sort of maybe the reason this album failed because who is it for? You know what I mean? Like who wanted to listen to this?
Yeah.
I think people who were fans of the Saints at the height of their popularity didn't want to hear this.
Yeah. By height of their popularity, you mean the mid-late 80s?
Mid to late 80s.
No, they didn't want to hear this.
They didn't want to hear this. I think people who liked the earlier Saints albums didn't really want to hear this either.
Yeah, insofar as the early... Well, it doesn't have quite the tempo of the first album, and it doesn't have the classiness, vague post-punkiness of the second and third album, so yeah.
And then, like, I don't think... you know, people who were listening to like the actual pop punk that was like popping off at the time wanted
No,
to listen to it.
young people didn't want nothing to do with this.
I think this was a record that just like doesn't really speak to anyone particularly. With retrospect, it's actually a decent album.
Yeah, it actually kind of does something with the aesthetic of the time. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Not something I would ever pop. Maybe, you know, before if I lived to like 100, I'd probably listen to this album at least one more time.
Yeah. This next one is the least familiar for me of any Saints albums. I only listened to this for the first time yesterday. What's the name of it again?
It's called Spit the Blues Out.
Spit the Blues Out. Yeah. It's the through this era of like 90s and 2000s Saints albums, they were sort of returning to hard rock, where like none of their 80s albums had really been hard rock, except for kind of the Monkey Puzzle album, but even that, not really.
Is
like,
pub rock hard rock all the time? Not always.
Not really, nah.
Cold Chills is not hard rock.
I mean, some of their music is, but most
Yeah.
of it is,
A lot of it's just power ballady shit.
Yeah, power.
I fucking hate Cold Chills. It's like
Yeah.
everyone. Hate Jimmy Barnes.
Yeah, this album was okay. I think this was like a sound that he Bailey had been doing on a lot of his solo records in the lead up to this time, and it translates all right into a Saints full length album. It's like, I don't know, like punk blues has like a really, like, Australia is the country of like punk blues, has like a sound, and like this album adds like nothing to this tradition. I don't know.
I don't think I like. I'm not the biggest blues guy. I do like blues in that. Well, here's the thing. I've never gone out of my very rarely, unless I was getting the cursory understandings of what it actually is, did I go out of my way to listen to blues music. If I go over to someone's residence or whatever, and they're playing blues music, I'm gonna have a great time because, oh, great! I'm never gonna listen to this in my spare time. This is it, and I'm enjoying it. But yeah, that's just where I'm at with the blues. And punk blues, it could work. I don't know.
Like, well, I'll put it this way. Like, I do actually like a lot of classic blues and blues rock records. Like, I mean...
See, you name blues rock in particular, that now we're losing me.
Well, like, for example...
Blues, I'm way more into than blues rock.
One of my favorite musicians in general is Rory Gallagher.
Oh,
like, that's an example of blues rock, and just, like, everything you could do with that sound.
Yeah. But
I think... And for punk blues, I'd say the drones on "Wait Long by the River" and the bodies of, is it Your Enemies Will Float By?
Don't know the drones.
I forget the full name of that album. It's something like that. It's a fantastic album. It's like one of their two really good albums.
I will say, in regard to punk blues, an album that I think is fantastic and I love, called Fire of Love by the Gun Club, has been characterized as punk blues, which I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, this Saints album, I don't know, you didn't seem to have a great response to it, and yeah, to be honest, like, it just, this didn't, other than the vocals, this didn't, I guess... If I said it didn't sound like a Saints album, like, well, what is the Saints really then? Because only a couple albums had Ed Cooper's experimentation on it anyway. But no, this didn't make a mark on me, I'm afraid.
I'd have to concur that I'd put this towards the bottom of Sepathe Records. Like, I'm a blues guy, but I think the formula is really like what you put into it in terms of like intensity and emotion and so on. And I think this one didn't really. This one really didn't fully hit it for me. It's okay though. Like, I don't dislike this album. I think the only album that I really dislike is the aforementioned Prodigal Son.
This is another case as well where Spit the Blues Out, actually, the one that comes after, this is a bit overshadowed, but I actually think the one that came after this was a bit stronger.
Yeah, totally.
Because this one sounds a bit, it's not like, it's not the most, it's definitely not the most impressive album in the world, nor is it the most creative album in the world. It's a little bit creative. It's a very playful album, and like, it's just, I don't know, it just comes across to me like they're having, it doesn't sound cynical, it sounds like they had the opportunity to record another album and they were excited at the prospect of doing it, and jammed out in the studio a few serviceable
it's like
tracks, at least, you know, serviceable in the context. We're in the context of, okay, I've got to listen to a few albums, I've got to listen to, what was it been? 5 albums from like 5:30 onward. This is like, yes, it's kind of good.
Yeah, it's a decent album. Nothing is straight in my house. Like this is like a hard rock kind of thing.
Yeah.
With very like noisy alt rock production.
Yeah.
Type thing. It's really this is another one. This is kind of like a duology with the album that came after it. And this is the one that I prefer. It's kind of like after a period in the wilderness in a lot of ways over the past series of albums, they were like finding a musical voice that I think like worked somewhat at the time. It's not going to change. It's not going to blow anyone's world.
No, it's just, it's surprisingly kind of adequate, pleasing, I don't know.
Yeah, I feel similarly about the next one as well, which is Imperious Delirium.
This feels like a momentum album.
Yeah, this was one of the earlier ones that I had as well. I think like around the time of its release, actually. But it's like a lesser iteration of the previous album.
I agree.
Where like there was a bunch of, as you say, momentum. It's kind of going through the motions a little bit. It feels just like extending the energy that the previous record started.
Yeah.
It's definitely like not an essential listen in any way, shape, or form. It's not an album that I really will see myself like returning to.
I can't say that either, to be honest.
And then they had one more formal studio album, and this one, I got this. I think it was for my birthday in 2012, the CD of this. And this is my third favorite Saints album.
Okay.
And the reason why, I know this is not generally seen as a classic or anything.
I can see why it's one of yours.
Well, wait till you see. This is the album that I was talking about when I said this is a concept album. And at the time, this was described as like a concept album about returning from a 100 Years war. That's not what it's really about. That's just the cover story. This album is really about, it's like Bailey reflecting on his own life and like the art of like songwriting and like who he's become. And this album is really like a final statement in a lot of ways. You listen to some of the lyrics on this. This is really about like, you know, there's this ironic thing. I was reading some of the reviews yesterday when I was listening to this again, and there's a track later in the album called "Craters on the Moon," which gets like, I was reading a few reviews that like criticize the lyrics on it for being so simple, but what they don't mention and what they're seemingly unaware of, that song is about how he feels like lost and can't write like a song anymore, and how he's not going to make any music anymore, and he's like quitting the music business and quitting writing new songs and making new records. And it's all like done up in this kind of like cryptic, like poetic lines, and I think a lot of it is kind of impenetrable for how it seems to be in reference to things that we'll never have access to, and in the way that the album was like publicly presented. I think there was like a defensiveness of that. You know what I mean? Like there was it was presented in a way to it's like a real statement from the heart that's like done up in such a way that no one else will know.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the songs are really fucking powerful on this album. Yeah, it's just like there's emotion, and another thing that's interesting about this is this album falls at like the natural musical point where the Saints should have been from like 1986 to present. You know what I mean? Like this is the music that Bailey was writing in its natural form.
Yeah.
In a way that he hadn't presented it because of like the legacy of previous albums. Like you think about like through a lot of their 80s records, like it's kind of different for like stuff like Casablanca. I think that album is in its natural form.
Yeah.
But like they had horns and they tried to keep some of that post-punk sensibilities in like All Fool's Day and Prodigal Son, and they tried to do the alternative rock thing with Howling and so on, as we've talked about, but that's not where the music naturally sat.
No, those are trends they're jumping on.
Yeah, and those were, I think there was like a self-consciousness about, and I feel like it's even discussed in some ways in this album. Like there was a self-consciousness about like the legacy of the Saints, this like hard rock band, one of the founders of punk music.
Yeah,
you know?
but only 2 of their albums are really acclaimed.
Yeah.
Maybe 3.
Yeah, I mean, Prehistoric Sounds has a degree of acclaim.
I was thinking, you know what? Yeah, I wasn't considering the first album, but yeah, that does get acclaim.
Oh, the first album's like the big acclaimed one, right?
I was assumed Eternally Yours, because like Eternally Yours seems to be the one that, maybe I'm mistaken on this, but like if we opened like top 100 Australian albums, that book Eternally Yours would be the High Saints album.
You know, it's funny you say that, because I was given that book at the time, and
oh wow,
you know, that's the one of the 3 that isn't in there.
Prehistoric Sounds is in there, and
Prehistoric
Unstranded
Sounds
is in there.
and I'm Stranded is in there. And
That seems
not
peculiar.
Eternal.
Wow.
It's
Isn't
surprising.
Eternally Yours the most accessible of the 3?
I think so, and I think if we ask people on the street in Australia what their favourite Saints album is, the overwhelming consensus would be Eternal Years.
What's their most famous song? Know Your Product?
Yeah, it might, today it might be Know Your Product. I would.
At the time in the 80s, this might have been a different story.
It wouldn't have. It would have been either Ghost Ships or maybe Just Like Firewood.
Yeah.
Because that was like a pretty high charting hit.
Mm.
I think that was like played on MTV and shit back in the day.
Oh, cool.
You know, that was quite a hit in those days.
Right.
But yeah, I think maybe Know Your Product might be the most famous song in Australia.
Yes.
But I think globally it would be Stranded easily.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this album. What's this album called again? King of the Sun. This album, yeah, you sold me on this album a little bit. This album was closer to a singer-songwriter album, which reminded me of how much you love everything the Bats have put out over the years.
Yeah.
Because the Bats started out as a jangle pop group of the Dunedin era, which is how I certainly got into them with our great album called Daddy's Highway, 87. Yeah. And out of curiosity, I listened to some later Bats album. This is actually before you told me you were a fan of them. And I'd heard their 2008 album, I think it was. I was loaned for CD, played it in my car. I didn't really like it that much. But I listened to the 2 albums that have come out in the 2010s, and I'm like, wait, this is like a really good version of what like the Fleet Foxes want to do. It's just like a band I don't like at all. I think the Fleet Foxes were a band where I listened to like a later album and I was like, they're getting better, because I try to do that with bands I hated from the 2000s and 2010s. I really do, because I don't want to be too much of a curmudgeon. And like what they have access to like hi-fi studios. Like you'd think that like some producer would push them in a good direction.
Yeah.
Happened with Interpol, in my opinion. But anyway, moving on. Yeah, I think so. The Bats put out 2 really strong acoustic kind of singer-songwriter albums, and if you like things like, it's not as like, you know, traditionally English as something like, the example I was going to use is Fairport Convention. But that's very traditionally English music, so maybe the appeal isn't quite the same thing for the average Fairport Convention fan. But if you want a band that just plays acoustic instruments in like a 4-piece set and they just sing like traditional singer-songwriter tunes, those two Bats albums are really strong, and I think that, you know what, yeah, I'm willing to believe that King of the Sun can fall into that category as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really honest album.
Yes.
It's a really
Naked, yeah.
yeah.
Well, subtly naked, as you said, because that's a great point.
Yeah, it's a really like reflective record. Let me read some of the lyrics, because I
Please,
think
yeah.
if I can find them online. I was looking at them when I was like reading the
You said you had the CD.
yeah, because I played it off the CD.
Okay.
There's some that I don't know, like, okay, we need to find a version of the lyrics that don't. Oh man, someone's like transcribed the lyrics based on their ear, and it's not right.
Damn.
Anyway, I seriously suggest anyone listen to this album and like think about like what is being said in a lot of ways. There's a range of musical styles. There's actually like the second last song on this album is actually, in my view, it's a parody of Ed Cooper solo songs.
Okay.
I think it's called like Mini Mantra or something. It's like a mocking of his music. I don't know. There's just so much in this record that is just about, that is delving into history, that is kind of finding a poetic voice in Chris Bailey's music that was always and a musical register that always like wanted to be there but never was there for a range of reasons. Yeah, I strongly recommend this album. I liked it a lot at the time. I was hearing it in 2012, I was surprised by how much I liked it, and returning to it again, I do really like this album as well. I think it's an excellent final album, and I think in part because it was consciously a final album, and it was 10 years ago, and he's died now, rest in peace. But and I think the reason that he hasn't released any music since then is not because he was waiting for inspiration, although he's never sort of said that. The only recording project that was released by the Saints after this point, they released another version of this album where on the original version of the album they actually have newly recorded versions of some of the most significant songs in the Saints catalog post the initial split in the 70s.
Yeah.
And they did a re-release version which got rid of that half, and they replaced it with like stripped back kind of acoustic versions of the songs on the main half of the album. And it was just playing the same songs again. Like I think that to me just confirms my reading of the album, that like this was really consciously a final statement. And it came right after a period of time when, like, he'd been doing solo albums and stuff, and it's been silent since then. And I guess will always be. But yeah, a really strong album, a really strong final album, and I think one that was kind of like misunderstood at the time, and sort of it's easy to see why, because it came in the context of like, you have to remember that the era that we came up in it as music, and the era that this album was released immediately after, was an era where, one, you had like, the biggest thing in terms of the Saints was you had the expanded 25th anniversary re-releases of the first few albums in the early 2000s. That was one of the ways I got acquainted with them, because all that shit was at the libraries, and you had like best ofs coming out and stuff, and had all this stuff about the reevaluation of those early albums, like they're so important and stuff like that. I mean, that had been gradually happening since like the 90s, but like it had really exploded at that time to the point where like, you know, people now think like, oh, the era where they were successful were the early albums.
Yeah.
Then the other thing was you had the actual New Saints albums were stuff like, you know, Imperious Delirium and Nothing Straight in My House. And I think it really set the wrong expectations for this record, and people were looking for the wrong continuities in this album when it came out. And yeah, I think it's a really tightly knit, conceptually and musically, concept album that's really like devised in an album format where a lot of these Saints albums, yeah, there's like a cohesive aesthetic, but apart from that, they're just a bunch of tracks.
Yeah, of course.
Where this is really like an album.
Yeah.
Yeah, really strong album. Yeah, my third favorite, I'll say. Definitely would prefer to listen to this than the debut.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with that. I'm not the biggest fan of the debut, as I stated earlier. Wow, Saints discography. Is there any other albums you want to talk about in this context?
Not in particular. I mean, we could mention, like, for example, the Chris Bailey album with H. Burns, the French alternative rock group. I mean, they're okay. I think in general, apart from the first two solo albums, and maybe the 54 Days at Sea, which was his album from 94 or something, like, his solo albums are not really, like, they're just a lot worse than the group records. I think it about covers it. In final summation, I think the thing to say is, like, I've always been someone who's seen Ed Cooper as the genius of the Saints, and yeah, he was, but there's a lot of stuff that's of interest in that musical lineage that came after he left, and I think the trajectory that they went on their own is like kind of worthwhile in its own right. And they were certainly one of the best Australian bands in their, you know, in whatever way we might call them Australian. Australian groups, popular groups of that time playing that kind of music. And I think some of their albums deserve a significant reevaluation. I think particularly Casablanca and King of the Sun, I think could be albums that deserve, like, you know, Casablanca probably deserves a reissue and classic status, and King of the Sun, I think, is really ripe for reevaluation after Bailey's death. You know, highlights some of the meaning and some of the emotion that was really there in that album that was sort of missed at the time because it was too easy to miss.
Yeah, if I want to share a few thoughts on the Saints, it would be very few little four-piece rock bands come along and it's just like, okay, they have something to the rock music formula, to the rock band formula, basic rock band formula, not a progressive rock band, not a
avant-garde or like musically experimental.
Yeah.
Apart from, you know, to some degree, prehistoric sounds, but like not in an insanely experimental way.
Yeah, we're not going to call it psychedelic rock or art rock, for example.
You could probably call prehistoric sounds art rock, but you
Okay.
couldn't. I wouldn't, like, for example, there are so many albums in the 70s, rock albums, that are just like far more avant-garde than that album. I think it's definitely. How about this? Tell me what you think of this. They don't have an album that really, like, departs the territory of like a pop rock album.
Not particularly, no.
Yeah. So that's how I categorize it.
Yeah, I think few of these bands can just come together with just a great sound and a great ethos of we're going to stand out, and not a lot of rock bands. They just don't want a real job. I sympathize with them, but like I'm not going to listen to your albums. Like the Saints, I think like any other band, like there were dozens of bands like the Clash, but the Clash in the scene of the Clash, and the Clash just stood out. There was something about them. They were talented people, and they put out some great albums and some stinky albums later on too. Like it just. Like it's just one of these things. A band can have a magic, and then you can be relevant, and then once you try to be a bit, I don't know. It's like there's a dicey game of being conservative with your sound versus experimenting, jumping on too many new trends.
Yeah.
There's a balance that for so few artists can pull off, and even fewer bands, like
Yeah.
4 people with different opinions, can
Yeah.
pull off. It's just extraordinary, and yeah, I think I feel blessed that we got at least two really fantastic Saints albums, by which I mean the collaboration of Bailey and Cooper.
Yeah.